this evening. Thank you so much for all that you do to support us as we preserve the hallowed ground related to our first 100 years, and we tell our shared American story. And our American story tonight starts at Cold Harbor. And at least for me, the name Cold Harbor sort of harkens some type of foreboding, a sense of doom. And I first visited the battlefield when I was about 8 years old with my father, and standing behind the Confederate earthworks, staring out across the open field, dotted by pines and oak trees, you sort of get a sense of darkness standing on particular parts of that battlefield. Thomas Hyde, who was an officer in the Sixth Corps of the Army of the Potomac, wrote in his memoirs that it is very interesting to revisit the battlefields of the war, but I never heard anyone who was engaged there at Cold Harbor express an interest to see Cold Harbor. Its vast upheavals of earth and fort and rifle pit in traverse and covered way may now have yielded to the sun, the rain, and the plow, but it remains the Golgotha of American history. Now, obviously, Hyde was not speaking of these earthworks that you could find, that you can still see today on the battlefield should you choose to visit. But images such as this, taken after the war, the interment of the dead at Cold Harbor, and I think one of the most famous photographs taken of the American Civil War, certainly reinforce that sense of doom, that sense of foreboding. They reinforce the words that Hyde wrote after the war. Cold Harbor comes at the end of some of the most storied and brutal fighting in the history of the United States Army. The fighting between Ulysses S. Grant and Robert E. Lee in what becomes known as the Overland Campaign, a campaign that begins just west of where I'm sitting in Fredericksburg, Virginia, in the wilderness on May 5th, 1864. And in 2 days of fighting, both sides, both the Army of Northern Virginia and the Army of the Potomac, will sustain a combined 30,000 casualties. But then something momentous happens, something quiet but momentous, and a watershed nonetheless. Grant decides that he will not retreat. It will be the first time in the history of the Army of the Potomac that after engaging Robert E. Lee in battle, that the Army of the Potomac will not withdraw. They will not retreat from the battlefield. Grant decides that he will move onward, on to Spotsylvania Courthouse, just to the south of the wilderness, to break out into open country, to utilize his superior numbers. But Lee wins the race at Spotsylvania, and we begin to see there the formulation, the evolution, the adjustment in defensive and offensive warfare. And if you're going to join us next Thursday when I come back to talk more about Cold Harbor and the Overland Campaign, we are going to talk in great detail regarding the fixed fortifications, those field fortifications that we begin to see begin at Spotsylvania and grow as the armies move ever southward toward slugging it out from Spotsylvania to the Confederate capital at Richmond. But at the same time, we're also going to see, and this again something I'm going to talk about next Thursday evening as well, the Union adjustments, the modifications, the innovations and tactics as they face something that they've yet to face before in Virginia in the Eastern Theater, which will come to a culmination, if you will, at Cold Harbor. And in fact, at Spotsylvania, the great moment at Spotsylvania comes at the Muleshoe Salient on May 12, 1864, with the longest sustained combat of the American Civil War that takes place along a stretch of the Confederate earthworks known as the Bloody Angle. The armies will stay at Spotsylvania for 13 days, and there will be another 30,000 casualties at Spotsylvania Courthouse. But Grant still is undeterred. He decides to, once again, swing around Lee's right flank, turn to the east. He's going to head south to the North Anna River. But this time, he wants to get Lee out of Spotsylvania Courthouse, out from behind those mass fortifications into open country. But he also is looking toward threatening Lee's supply lines, Virginia Central Railroad around Doswell, modern Doswell, Hanover Junction. Virginia Central Railroad connects not only the Shenandoah Valley, the breadbasket of the Confederacy, with Lee's army, but it also connects Lee with his capital at Richmond. But once again, just like at Spotsylvania, Lee is going to win the race to the North Anna River. In fact, he's going to set a trap for Grant. He's going to pull back his army that you can see here on the map into two massive wings that you can see here, an inverted V. And Grant's going to walk right into the trap. The trap is going to be set, but it will not be sprung. Grant's going to divide his massive army, one on the western branch of the inverted V, the other on the eastern branch of the inverted V. But Lee, due to a loss in his catastrophic loss of subordinate officers that he can depend on, is unable to spring the trap on Grant and launch a major assault and perhaps deal a fatal blow to Grant and the Army of the Potomac at the North Anna River. And Grant, I think to a certain degree, he realizes that he's gotten lucky along the banks of the North Anna River. So he casts about for other options, and that begins the great long road, the road that we're going to travel tonight and next Thursday, the road to Cold Harbor. And it's going to begin on May 25th when Grant, realizing that he's ducked a massive blow from the Army of Northern Virginia, he casts about for other options. Once again, he's going to look to the east, around Lee's eastern flank. He's going to move toward the east, shift his supplies to White House Landing on the Pamunkey River. A movement to the east is going to put him ever closer to the Confederate capital at Richmond, a capital that Grant understands that Lee must defend at all costs. It's also going to put him closer to Major General Benjamin Butler's Army of the James, then operating south of Richmond, at that time bottled up at Bermuda 100. But it's going to put him closer to reinforcements. It's going to shorten his supply lines, and he's going to try to put Lee in a very precarious position with having to defend his capital, putting Lee's back, in fact, to Richmond. But Grant's also at the same time giving up his ace in the hole, if you will. Throughout the course of the campaign, from the Wilderness to the North Anna, Grant has relied on maneuverability to break each stalemate. But his target this time is an area between the Pamunkey River and the Chickahominy River. Grant is starting to bottle himself off, so to speak, perhaps forcing himself, looking himself for that final battle that's going to take place somewhere in Virginia in the summer of 1864. Grant's going to begin pulling away from the North Anna River on May the 26th. His army's going to march, withdrawing out of as I mentioned a few moments ago, a very precarious situation, pulling back from the North Anna River and swinging well to the east to cross at Nelson's Bridge and Dabney's Ferry on the Pamunkey River. This movement again begins on May 26th. And by May 27th, the Army of the Potomac is set on this north bank of the Pamunkey River to begin crossing the Pamunkey and making what Grant hopes to be that final drive onto Richmond. Lee, at the same time, once again, just like he did at Spotsylvania, just like he did at the North Anna, is going to counter. He's going to be pulling back out of his inverted V, out of those fortifications at the North Anna River, and pulling back to the south, and then turning to the east, hoping to find Grant somewhere to the east, to the northeast of Richmond. But all at the same time, Lee's doing two things. He's shielding Grant from Richmond. He's keeping between Grant and his capital. And at the same time, he's shielding the Virginia Central Railroad. He's trying to protect Atlee Station, which you can see in the lower to the left center of the map. The armies are going to disengage. And on May the 28th, the Army of the Potomac is going to begin crossing the Pamunkey River. But because the armies have disengaged, neither Lee nor Grant really have a good sense as to where one another is. And that's going to set the stage for the first battle on the road to Cold Harbor. And it's going to be set by the individual that you see there in the center of the photograph, the short individual standing under the guidon, little Phil Sheridan. Phil Sheridan has come from the Western Theater. He's taken command of the Army of the Potomac's cavalry. He's one of Grant's favorites. He has at the same time not ingratiated himself with the Army's commander, George Meade, but at the same time, he has dealt a major blow to Lee and his army. He is mortally wounded and then killed Jeb Stuart earlier in the month of May, May 11th, May 12th, the Battle of Yellow Tavern. And it's going to be Sheridan who's going to receive the assignment, not only one of protecting that bridgehead across the Pamunkey River from the Confederates, but he's going to be dispatched by George Gordon Meade and Ulysses S. Grant to move out from the Pamunkey River, push out, and find the Army of Northern Virginia. Sheridan's going to do that first with the man to his immediate, his right, our left, seated there with the long beard, David McMurtry Gregg, and Gregg's 2nd Cavalry Division. One of Gregg's brigade commanders is going to be heavily involved in the coming fight. Henry Davies is to Gregg's right, our left. Alfred Torbert and his division. Torbert is standing to the right of the photograph, to Sheridan's left. He's standing with, he is wearing the double-breasted frock coat, if you will, and the sailor shirt underneath with the very large collars. This coming operation is going to involve David Gregg and Alfred Torbert. On the other side of the lines, Robert E. Lee is going to send Lieutenant General Major General Wade Hampton. Lee, through the course of the campaign, has sustained a tremendous loss in his officer corps. He's lost his 1st Corps commander, his old warhorse, James Longstreet, on the 2nd day in the Wilderness. Jeb Stuart, who I just mentioned, has also fallen at the Battle of Yellow Tavern. And after Stuart's death, Lee, in fact, refuses to appoint a successor, effectively having the various cavalry divisions of his army report directly to Army headquarters. So Lee is not only an army commander, a theater commander, he's a cavalry commander through the latter weeks of May of 1864. But he's going to send Wade Hampton, a South Carolinian, a veteran officer wounded at First Manassas, wounded as well on the 3rd day at Gettysburg, and the senior general officer in Stuart's old corps, away from Atlee Station, away from his growing line along Potomac Creek, which I'm going to talk just a little bit more about in just a few moments. He's going to send them toward the Pamunkey crossings to report back on Grant's progress and to effectively try to delay the Army of the Potomac's crossing. Now, this is a very important battle, or what the battle is about to develop into on the afternoon of May 28th of 1864. Sheridan has been sent out, just to recap really quickly, by George Meade to find the Army of Northern Virginia. The same thing for Wade Hampton. Lee has sent him out to find and locate the Army of the Potomac, but it is very important for the Army of the Potomac that Sheridan holds his ground. He holds that bridgehead on the south bank of the Pamunkey, because as Sheridan is riding out on his reconnaissance, the Union infantry from the Army of the Potomac is flooding across the Pamunkey River. And Sheridan's cavalry is going to, David Gregg's division, in fact, is going to collide with Wade Hampton in this area today around Hawes Shop, Virginia. You can see the home of John Hawes, the White House in the distance off to the right. John Hawes was a local blacksmith, a local machinist, he owned what was then, of course, called Hawes Shop. He was an industrialist. Much of his equipment had, in fact, been confiscated by the Confederate government and taken to Tredegar Iron Works early in the war in the summer of 1862. But Haw, his wife, as well as a number of slaves, have remained in their house here, and they're going to be caught in the maelstrom in the Battle of Hawes Shop on the afternoon of May 28, 1864. In the area just west of modern, or at the time, Enon Church, Henry Davies's brigade is going to collide with the vanguard of Hampton's advance, and there's going to be a seesaw cavalry action that takes place through much of the middle of the afternoon in these fields here. This photograph was in fact taken from the churchyard of Enon Church, which witnessed the battle. As the course of the day goes along, both sides reach an equilibrium, if you will, but Alfred Torbert's division, which has been guarding the river crossings, which would have been located on the Pamunkey River just well to the north of where this photograph was taken, is finally going to be released by George Meade. He's going to ride to Sheridan's assistance. He's going to reinforce Sheridan's position. He's going to send the brigades of Wesley Merritt and George Custer forward, ultimately breaking Hampton's line and forcing Hampton to pull back toward Lee's burgeoning line, his new line along a tributary of the Pamunkey River known as Totopotomoy Creek. At the same time, Sheridan, after this day-long battle, he's going to pull back. He's going to leave a vacuum right in front of the Army of the Potomac. His cavalry screen is simply going to disappear. He's going to withdraw to an area to the southeast called Old Church, which I'm going to show you here on a map in just a moment. I have a photograph to show you later on. And with Sheridan's withdrawal back to Old Church, he essentially, again, he leaves this gap between the two armies. It's typically the cavalry's responsibility to screen the front and the flanks of an army's advance. Sheridan has taken himself out of the equation by withdrawing to Old Church. So it's going to be left to the Union infantry to move out from those Pamunkey crossings and find Lee in the Army of Northern Virginia. And spearheading that advance is Winfield Scott Hancock. This photograph was taken at Cold Harbor just several days after this action that we're talking about tonight. You can see Hancock seated there. To the left is Francis Barlow. Behind Hancock is David Birney, and to our right and Hancock's left is John Gibbon. And it will be Francis Barlow on May 29th who's going to make first contact with elements from the Army of Northern Virginia, the First Corps under Richard Anderson here in this area. This is the area around Totopotomoy Creek. This is the Totopotomoy Creek battlefield unit of the Richmond National Battlefield Park. You can go there, visit Totopotomoy Creek, or Rural Plains as this house is known. Obviously social distancing and keeping up with all the health and safety guidelines. But Barlow's men are going to reach this area of Rural Plains, the ancestral home of the Shelton family. This house was built prior to 1675, and in 1754, the great Virginia patriot and founding father Patrick Henry is going to be married to the daughter of John Shelton in this house. And the Shelton family, Colonel Edwin Shelton's wife, along with several children, several slaves, are going to be occupying this area when Barlow reaches this area on May 29th of 1864. And if you've ever been to Rural Plains, if you've ever been to Totopotomoy Creek and taken a walk along the trails that are maintained by the National Park Service, you're going to notice that the area around Rural Plains, if you're a civilian, it's not the best place to be because it's on a high elevated plateau. It's an excellent artillery platform, and that's what it's going to become for Hancock's gunners through the course of May 29th, May 30th. Again, facing elements from Richard Anderson's First Corps. You can see here in the middle of the map, I'm trying to mouse over it here for you, the Shelton House with Barlow's division. It's going to be filled in on his right by David Birney. Horatio Wright's Sixth Corps is going to come up and tie in with Barlow's right flank through the course of May 29th. But it's not until May the 30th along Totopotomoy Creek where things are really going to start to heat up. Both sides have now find themselves. They're both going to start digging in and preparing for the next slugfest that's going to take place northeast of Richmond. And it begins in the morning when Colonel Nelson Miles's brigade of Barlow's division is going to send out a reconnaissance consisting of the 2nd New York Heavy Artillery and newly arrived 2nd New York Heavy Artillery and the 61st New York Infantry. They're going to probe Anderson's lines along Totopotomoy Creek. At the same time, John Rutter Brooks' brigade is going to send out 2 regiments, the 7th New York Heavy Artillery Regiment, which I'm going to talk in a great amount of detail when you join us again next Thursday evening, as well as the 148th Pennsylvania Infantry. They probe Lee's lines. They find that Lee's line is tremendously strong along the banks of Totopotomoy Creek. But as I mentioned earlier, the ground around Rural Plains, around the Shelton House, is an ideal artillery platform. And Colonel John Tidball, Hancock's chief of artillery, is going to deploy a number of batteries there to shell the Confederate lines just opposite him. In fact, Lieutenant John Roeder, Battery K of the 4th U.S. Artillery, writes to us in his official report that through the course of the day on May 30th, his battery expended well over 200 rounds of ammunition, sending them flying into the Confederate position. At the same time, Lee is monitoring the Union movements along Totopotomoy Creek. He knows about Miles's reconnaissance. He knows about Brooks' reconnaissance. And he also at the same time receives word from one of his scouts, a fellow named Frank Stringfellow. Frank Stringfellow has been operating off of the Confederate right flank in the area around Old Church, where Sheridan has gone to encamp after the fighting at Hawes shot. And Stringfellow reports back to Lee that there's a strong cavalry presence in the area just off of the Confederate right flank in the area around Old Church. And this is especially alarming to Robert E. Lee, because Lee interprets this intelligence as the beginnings of a grand movement, another flanking movement, just as Grant has done after the Wilderness, after Spotsylvania, after the North Anna, another flanking movement around his far right flank in the vicinity of Old Church, but even more so in the vicinity of a crossroads several miles south of Old Church that we're very familiar with and will become very familiar with tonight and next Thursday, Crossroads at Cold Harbor. Two roads intersect at Cold Harbor. One of those roads leads directly to Lee's capital, Richmond. And it's only 5 miles from Richmond. And that is a intersection that Lee has become very aware of, but it's not becoming too important to him just yet. What's important to Lee is after these probes along the banks of the Totopotomoy Creek, he decides that he wants to launch an offensive. And for that, he's going to turn to the individual you see on the screen right now, Major General Jubal Early, who has taken over command of the Second Corps. This is Stonewall Jackson's old corps. Early himself, a veteran of the Second Corps, who had served under Jackson in the campaigns of 1862 to 1863. And what Lee notices about Grant's lines around Totopotomoy Creek is that while Winfield Scott Hancock, go back to the map, occupies an area north of the creek, the Union Fifth Corps under Governor Kimball Warren occupies an area south of Totopotomoy Creek. And Lee divines that if he's going to strike anywhere along Grant's front along Totopotomoy Creek, he's going to focus on Warren. He's below the creek, not necessarily within supporting distance. And that's something that becomes very important, in fact, to Warren as he advances on May 29th and May 30th. He has been sending word back to Army headquarters and to Phil Sheridan to come out and cover his left flank, the Old Church Road, the Richmond Road, the Mechanicsville Turnpike, if you will, modern Route 360. That is an avenue of advance that the Confederates could exploit on Warren's far left flank. And Warren is very concerned about covering that left flank as he advances out from the Pamunkey crossings to link in with Hancock's line along Totopotomoy Creek. And that is exactly how Early is going to approach Warren's line. He's going to utilize the Old Church Road, the Richmond Stage Road, again, modern Route 360, to advance on the afternoon of May 30th, 1864, against Warren's position. Leading Early's advance is Major General Robert Rhodes's division. I think Robert Rhodes is one of the finest, if not the best, division commanders in the Army of Northern Virginia that no one's ever heard of. Very unheralded, an incredibly skilled commander nonetheless. Rhodes is going to open the action with, you can't see it here on this map, but with North Carolinians commanded by Brigadier General Brian Grimes. Grimes is going to collide with the old Pennsylvania Reserves Division, a brigade commander you can see there in the center of the map by Colonel Martin Hardin. The fighting is going to open just west of a house of worship known as Bethesda Church. Unfortunately, Bethesda Church is no longer standing for us today. The Confederates are going to quickly gain the upper hand, push Hardin back, and then Hardin's going to fall back to the main position along the Shady Grove Road, in a position that Warren has, in fact, prepared for them. And one of the members of the Pennsylvania Reserves, an individual in the 2nd Pennsylvania Reserves, is going to write about the subsequent attack that you can see here depicted in the sketch on Warren's line along the Shady Grove Road. That attack is going to be led by Colonel Edward Willis's Virginia Brigade from Stephen Ramser's division. And that officer, that individual in the Pennsylvania Reserves, is going to write about 25 yards in front of the rifle pits. was a fence and some bushes that concealed our pits and men from view. The enemy advanced the fence in most excellent order. And as they reached it, our whole line, which had not yet fired a shot, opened upon them a crushing fire of musketry. I love that quote. A crushing fire of musketry. The volleys of the Pennsylvania Reserve supporting artillery rip gaps into the ranks of Willis's brigade, forcing the Confederates ultimately to abandon their position and withdraw back to the main line along Totopotomoy Creek, thus ending the Battle of Bethesda Church, or what is known as the Battle of Bethesda Church. But the fighting isn't quite over for the day on May 30th. There's still one more chapter that has to play out, and that's going to take place between a small stream called Metadequin Creek and Old Church. The photograph that you see here on the screen is of Sheridan's new headquarters at Old Church. And when Lee received that intelligence from Frank Stringfellow, he immediately sent out 2 brigades of South Carolina cavalry from the village of Mechanicsville to investigate Sheridan's presence around Old Church. Those brigades are led by Matthew Calvert Butler and Martin Gary. And you can see here to the right, lower right center of the map, that Butler is going to lead his own brigade as well as Gary's brigade in a reconnaissance through New Cold Harbor, through Old Cold Harbor, and they're going to engage Alfred Torbert's division along the banks of Metadequin Creek just south of Old Church. There's going to be a very sharp running cavalry fight between Metadequin Creek and Old Church as the sun begins to go down on May 30th, 1864. Ultimately, Sheridan is going to hold his ground. He's going to push Butler and Gary back to a new defensive position below the creek. But Sheridan's blood is up on May the 30th. He's won a victory at Hawes Shot. He's won another victory at Metadequin Creek. But the Confederates came out swinging from their corner on the banks of Metadequin Creek. And the next day, Sheridan is going to begin making plans for another push, a larger push against, go back to the map, against the Confederate cavalry. And that push, that offensive, is going to take him to a very critical intersection, an intersection I already mentioned. It's growing in importance for Lee, but will become incredibly important for Ulysses S. Grant and George Meade as the calendar of May 1864 turns to June of 1864. And as Mike mentioned, I'm going to stop sharing with you for just one moment. I would like to share with you not only the appeal that he mentioned, an effort that we're currently working on, an effort that we've dubbed the Gaines Mill Cold Harbor Save Forever campaign, where we're working to, as Mike showed, preserve 108 acres, which will ultimately be put into a conservation easement, which will preserve it for in perpetuity. But we're working to preserve very important acreage, not only of the Cold Harbor battlefield, but of the Gaines Mill battlefield as well. But I'd also like to share with you on our website. I'm going to pull that back up in just a moment. We're also working to save, if you can see my screen, we're also working to save the actual intersection, the Cold Harbor Tavern site, the location that really gives its name, Cold Harbor, to the area and the tavern that was there that witnessed the major fighting on May 31st, June 1st through 12th of 1864. You can go over to battlefields.org, click on the Donate Now button over on to the right-hand side of the screen to donate or to become a member. And again, for those members who are out there tonight, this evening, again, thank you so much for all that you do. Thank you so much for supporting us. I hope that to see you soon in person, ideally, and I look forward to seeing you all once again. Thank you for all that you do in assisting us with battlefield preservation. And I will turn it with that back over to Mike, and we'd be more than happy to answer any of your questions.
All right. So thank you, Dan. Bill says hello from Indianapolis, and Sue Ann says hello from Southwest Virginia. Mike says hi from New Jersey. Kevin says, what does Kevin say? Howdy from Lynchburg, Virginia. Don Haven says, good evening from Southern California. And Unan says, hi from Gettysburg. Gary says, hello from Central Maine. And you'll like this, is that Unan says, the last O in Totoponomy Creek is silent. It is pronounced Totoponomy.
Excellent. Learn something new every day.
There you go. So John says, can't wait to go on your walking tours again. And Jerry says, great job, Dan. Thank you.
Thank you.
So what are your questions? Here we go. Hello from headquarters near Memphis, Tennessee. All is well, General Grant. Doug asks, does the battlefield trust in any way feel threatened in this current political, cultural environment?
That question was from Doug?
Yes.
Well, I appreciate that question, Doug. Thank you for joining tonight. From my perspective, we're continuing to do what we've always done. We focus on saving battlefields and hallowed ground, and I think that's a way that's going to continue forward, and that's a good track record that we've established over the course of the last, I would say, 25 to 30 years, and there's no reason to alter that course right now.
Bill says, what were the casualty numbers at North Anna and Spotsylvania?
Spotsylvania, there's probably a little over 30,000 casualties. I say there's probably a little over because I mentioned earlier the tremendous loss in the Office Corps of both armies, where officers who should be writing an official report on May 10th are killed on May 11th. Their successors killed on May 12th. Their successor is killed on May 14th. The reports are incomplete. The best that we can tell, there's about 30,000 casualties there, much less at North Anna. The armies are not in contact as much as they are at North Anna. I want to say there's probably under, I'm going to ballpark this, probably between 7,000 and 15,000 casualties at the North Anna, but don't quote me on that one.
Unan says, great job, Dan. What do you think went through Lee's mind when he found out Grant turned south?
Well, I think Lee probably understood at that particular moment in the wilderness that the war was changing. And I think that it was something that he understood himself. He knows that 1864 is an election year. He knows the war is not a popular one. He understands that the longer that he can keep the Army of the Potomac in the field and away from Richmond, the better it is going to be for him at the ballot box in November. I think Grant's turning first in the wilderness and then again at Spotsylvania, certainly, because you could consider wilderness and Spotsylvania to be one long battle from May 5th to May 21st. I think he understands that he's facing an entirely new opponent, and the war, I think it brings the idea home to him that the war, in fact, has changed.
John Scully asked, where do I get information on touring Totoponomy, Cold Harbor National Battlefield, and or the Trust or others?
I would say go over to our website, battlefields.org. We have a ton of content over there. Take a look for our apps. We have a number of apps you can download on your phone. Not only good to be out in the field and use them, but great content for you to use at home, depending on what your situation is given the current health circumstances. Also go over to the Richmond National Battlefield's website. It's nps.gov /RICH, I believe, or just Google Richmond National Battlefield. A ton of great content on their site. Obviously, a ton of great content on our site as well to help you get from the wilderness all the way to Cold Harbor and to tour rural plains and Potomac Creek.
Bill Miller says back in 2014, the National Park Service folks took our crowd to all of the sites that Dan has previewed. The flow of the activity that led operations to the main attack was very impressive. The Sheldon House was a real treat to view.
Yep, absolutely. Absolutely. It's a gem. Somewhat off the beaten path, but it's a fantastic site.
Eric asked, what was the road to Richmond that Grant was anxious to take at Cold Harbor? Is the road still present or is it lost to history?
Well, part of that road is still present. Some of it is still lost to history, but that is essentially the road that runs, the modern road that runs west from the Cold Harbor Visitor Center toward essentially modern 295. It's the road that actually Grant is he's ultimately going to become very interested in two roads that lead to Cold Harbor and the junction itself. One road is going to lead to his new supply base at White House Landing on the Pamunkey River. It's also going to lead to something we're going to talk about next week in the reinforcements from the 18th Corps of the Army of the James under William Smith. That's one of the roads that Grant is very concerned about. The other is the road that leads toward Richmond.
Dr. Fields asks, wasn't Lee fighting with the second and third string leadership by the time when you ended your presentation?
To a certain degree, I think you could make that argument. James Longstreet is down. Obviously, I think one of his greatest losses comes with Jeb Stewart, who dies on May 12th in Richmond. Richard Ewell has taken sick at Spotsylvania. AP Hill, as Hill is going to be, is also suffering from illness back and forth. So Lee is sort of dealing with former division commanders. Say that those division commanders aren't qualified. Jubal Early becomes a very trusted subordinate of Robert E. Lee. Richard Anderson does an excellent job taking over for James Longstreet and moving out of getting his men moving out of the wilderness and ultimately blocking Grant's route to Spotsylvania on the afternoon of or the evening of May 7th and into May the 8th. I think Wade Hampton personally is one of the finest cavalrymen in either theater to come out of the American Civil War. Yes, you're giving something up with Stewart, but whatever is being made up is being made up by Wade Hampton. He's an incredibly, I think to a certain degree, underrated commander. So yes, you could make that argument to a certain degree, but of those commanders, all of those subordinate officers who ultimately rise to command in the last days of May of 1864, I think Wade Hampton is probably the most successful, and most successful to the point of being on a level of a Jeb Stewart. Remember later, flash forward later on, he's going to defeat Phil Sheridan in the Battle of Trevilian Station in the second week of June of 1864.
T.J. Bradley says Breckinridge's troops are newly arrived to the Army of Northern Virginia during this period. How was their performance?
Their performance is actually quite well. Breckinridge is fresh off a victory at Newmarket in the Shenandoah Valley. John C. Breckinridge, I think, is another one of those underrated individuals who seems to pop up no matter where you are, either in Virginia or Tennessee, Mississippi. It does not matter. Breckinridge seems like he's always there. He's a solid commander. He's a reliable commander. His men perform very well along the banks of Potomac Creek. And again, later on in some of the fighting we're going to discuss next week and the first week of June at Cold Harbor.
Joe Joyce says, your overall opinion of Phil Sheridan. I would suggest a great battlefield leader, but not as skilled in cavalry command.
Now, Phil Sheridan, you don't have to look anywhere farther than Old Church to get a good idea of what Sheridan's like as a cavalry commander. What Sheridan has going for them is that he's a favorite of Grant. Grant is loyal to a fault, as many of us know, and moving into his presidency. Where's Phil Sheridan on? I look at this very kind of quite simply. Where's Phil Sheridan the day after Hawes shot? Nowhere to be found. He is not anywhere near Army headquarters. He is off doing his own thing and refitting and sitting tight at Old Church. That is because he has completely worn out his welcome at Army headquarters with the Army commander, George Meade. Meade and Sheridan clashed on May 8th, a very personal, well-documented, highly volatile argument face-to-face. They came to blows at Spotsylvania Courthouse because Meade felt that Sheridan had botched the movement out of the wilderness to Spotsylvania. Sheridan had not secured a Cree avenue of advance for the Army of the Potomac. Sheridan has I think, some issues. He's out of his depth as a cavalry commander. He's out of his depth as a corps commander, leading a large number of body of men of that size for the first time in the war. And I think to a certain degree, fast forwarding to the Shenandoah Valley, Grant sends his best soldiers from the Army of the Potomac to the Valley for Sheridan to command. There's a lot of talent in the Sixth Corps, in the Cavalry Corps, that goes to the Valley, talent that can make up for any shortcomings that Sheridan may have. He is obviously, having listened to that, you can probably gather he's not one of my favorite commanders. I'm not a fan of Phil Sheridan. But that's just me. Other people
are. Jerry Payne says, I have heard a concern that in Gettysburg, the trust has taken over so much that the village is short on taxes and is having financial concerns. Maybe other locations also. Is that true?
That I'm not too familiar with. I'm involved more in the history and interpretation side.
Did you want to do this at the same time?
I'm just being honest.
Right. Exactly. So was the railroad from White House available to resupply the Army of the Potomac at this time?
That's an excellent question. I'd actually have to go back and take a look at that. My interpretation is that from White House Landing, supplies were traveling overland by wagon to Grant's Army. But that's an excellent question, something I'd have to look more into.
All right. So maybe Thursday, right?
Maybe Thursday.
Frank Crawford asks, would you explain came to blows between Sheridan and Meade?
They have a very face-to-face heated confrontation where the air is filled with fill in your blank personal epithets, curse words, etc. There is a full-on confrontation. One of Meade's staff officers, Theodore Lyman, wrote that they came together hammer and tongs, which you can interpret that as loosely or as strictly as you wish. There is a very heated shouting match between the two men. And it essentially ends with Sheridan saying to Meade, I will only go out, in so many words, I will only go out and whip Jeb Stuart if you let me. So Meade, being the good commander that he is, decides to go to Grant and try to defuse the situation. When he explains what happens to Grant, Grant says in so many words, so Sheridan said that? Well, he generally means what he's talking about. Let him go right out and do it. And Grant himself, consciously or unconsciously, creates a rift in the command structure of the Army of the Potomac that will last through and will reverberate through to the end of the war.
So John Resto, in partial answer to Jerry's question, says, how would they take over the village? That means that they would be buying homes and stores. So, I'm sure that that Grant kind of wanted to rethink his letting go of the cavalry at Spotsylvania after that had taken place, because he did need them.
Absolutely, he needs them at Spotsylvania. He even needs them on the movement toward the North Anna. It's to have the entire cavalry corps go, all three divisions. It leaves Grant groping about blindly through Central Virginia. He's having to utilize, as after the fighting at Hawes Shop, he has to utilize his infantry to go find Lee or go find the Confederate position. So there are some cavalry regiments left with the Army of the Potomac, however, but I mean, essentially not enough. Sheridan takes the entire corps, about 12 to 15,000 men. I'm probably being generous with those numbers. There are several regiments left with the Army of the Potomac, essentially a cobbled together demi brigade, but certainly nothing that can be effective.
Bill Miller asks, when did the 18th Corps arrive at Cold Harbor?
18th Corps is not going to arrive until the afternoon of June 1st. They start pulling out when Grant pulls out from the North Anna River on the 26th. He sends orders back to Washington, the General-in-Chief Henry Halleck, to forward a message to Benjamin Butler on the Bermuda Hundred to start to send reinforcements to the Army of the Potomac. They are not actually, the Army of, or the Smith's 18th Corps. They are, I believe, embarking on May 28th on the afternoon as Hampton and Sheridan are slugging it out at Hawes Shop. They will sail down the James, up the Pamunkey, this shortened version, land at White House, and then march to eventually join Horatio Wright's 6th Corps at Cold Harbor on June 1st. They're on their way.
All right. So Eric asks, is there a sense that the South felt the end was near at this point in the war?
I don't think so. I think that sense starts to come in after Sheridan's victory at Cedar Creek in the Valley and Lincoln's reelection.
So John says that I did a tour of Spotsylvania Courthouse with Chris Makowski, and he did not have a high opinion of Sheridan either.
No, Chris and I agree on that. We don't think too highly of Phil Sheridan.
Sue Ann asked, where'd we go? Did Hampton eventually get put in command of all of the Army of Northern Virginia's cavalry?
Ultimately, yes. Lee will make that decision late in the summer, early in the fall, give or take, of 1864. But it's not after Hampton has won a victory over Sheridan one-on-one at the Battle of Trevilian Station. Hampton will remain with the Army of Northern Virginia at Petersburg. I think that's an interesting dynamic into and of itself. We look at the troops. We tend to focus our attention away from what's happening at Petersburg. We look to early in Sheridan in the Shenandoah Valley in the summer and fall of 1864. I think we miss the fact that Wade Hampton, he's still in Petersburg. He remains behind, as is David Gregg, two very solid commanders. And to keep those two commanders, their divisions on the Petersburg front, I think between Lee, Grant, and Meade attest to the value of a Wade Hampton and the value of David Gregg, which to a great degree, because of what happens in the Valley, goes unheralded through the remainder of the war.
Wayne would like to know, what source or book did you use for your maps in the presentation?
Some of those maps are from the Battlefield Trust. You probably recognize, many of you, the Steve Stanley maps. Also, the other maps, the black and white maps, are Maps that myself and Phil Greenwald had commissioned from Hal Jesperson for our book on Cold Harbor Hurricane from the Heavens.
Ron asks, didn't Sheridan's move with the cavalry pull the Confederate cavalry away from Lee as well?
It does to a certain degree, but Stuart's going to leave some cavalry behind to support Lee. He's going to take Fitz-Lee's division as well as a brigade from Wade Hampton's division under James Gordon. Gordon, unfortunately, is going to lose his life a day after Jeb Stuart dies in Richmond he's mortally wounded at the Battle of Meadow Bridge. Stuart's going to leave behind Wade Hampton's division, as well as some additional cavalry to support Lee at Spotsylvania.
All right, bear with me. Kurt says he really wanted to separate Meade and Sheridan to avoid further conflict. He also liked Sheridan more than he trusted Meade. However, he did cause his army to be essentially blind after he cut Sheridan loose. He made an error that may be attributed to a new commander who doesn't know his army as well as he could, which he was greatly concerned about prior to taking command. Then he had to move quickly against Lee because he knew Lincoln had brought him to the east specifically to meet Lee.
I agree.
All true. Frank asks, how was forage for Lee's as well as Grant's forces for the animals gotten?
It's going to be collected by the individual units themselves, the artillery units, as well as the cavalry units. Forage for that part of Virginia is, by that point in time in the wars, I would say probably relatively in good shape. And that area specifically has had 2 years to recover from Lee and McClellan clashing during the Peninsula Campaign and the 7 Days battles. We're still relatively untouched during the Fredericksburg Campaign, going back to December of 1862. So the farther that the armies withdraw or move south, Lee is obviously shortening his supply lines. He's having to, there's fodder for him to rely on. Same with Grant, Sheridan for that matter. Grant's doing the same thing as he is shifting from the wilderness to Spotsylvania to North Anna. He's shifting his supplies from Culpeper Brandy Station to Fredericksburg to Port Royal and eventually to White House Landing.
Bill Miller says Eric Wittenberg is a noted cavalry guy. I'll stick with his assessment of Little Phil.
And I agree with that assessment.
Unan says, I seem to remember that Grant once lamented that he never should have ordered the last attack at Cold Harbor. Is that true?
I think we're previewing next week. It's true. He does write that he does regret the fact that the last attack at Cold Harbor was ever made, in so many words. He writes that in his memoirs. Not to give too much away, but bearing in mind, I think we have to look at where Grant was in his life. He is literally on death's doorstep. He's going to finish those memoirs just days before he passes away. But also you have to look at not so much the Grant the human being, but Grant the Army commander. What does that mean? I regret the last assault was not more successful.
There you go.
You can, and that's again, and that can be interpreted in very broadly or very narrowly as you wish.
So Frank says thank you, and Kurt Field says Rufus Ingalls gets a lot of credit for the forage and material delivery. This campaign is when he innovated the painting of wagons with colors for ammunition, forage, food, etc. Also, wagons were marked for regiments, so each regiment got its share of supplies regardless of where it was located.
Yeah, and that's a great point. I think that's something that through the course of the history of the Army of the Potomac, not just going back to 1862, but especially in 63 and 64 when Meade is at the helm. He has some of the most talented officers serving under him in staff capacity. Rufus Ingalls, obviously. Henry Hunt, Chief of Artillery. Marcina Patrick, Provost Marshal. Odd fellows, don't get me wrong. Patrick was one of the oddest and one of the most entertaining reads you'll ever find anywhere, Union or Confederate, if you read his writings. But absolutely some incredibly talented individuals serve in the Army of the Potomac in those very important staff positions.
Kurt continues, Grant began that camping with 4,000 wagons and 40,000 to 60,000 horses and mules. Oh, that campaign. Excuse me. So there was quite a need for forage.
Yeah, that's an incredible feat, and that's also from the perspective of seeing an army on the march. That's an incredible sight.
Boy. So Eric says, "Thank you, great presentation."
Thank you.
So I think that with that, let's close the this chapter of the story and revisit it next Thursday at 7 p.m. Eastern with Daniel Davis and the Battle of Cold Harbor. Thank you very, very much, Dan, for being with us tonight, and thank you, ladies and gentlemen.